There is a particular quality to waiting that most people never learn to read correctly. They mistake it for inaction. They see a thing that is still and they conclude it is empty, that nothing of consequence is happening inside it, that the pause is the absence of purpose rather than purpose held in suspension. I have spent my career surrounded by people who understand waiting the way a musician understands silence, not as the gap between sounds but as the sound itself, the held note that gives everything around it its meaning. I am told the Kovari Restitution Fleet made that same mistake when they dropped from transit at the edge of the outer marker and found Earth's orbital shell quiet on their approach frequencies. They read the silence as abandonment. I was at my station on Thornwall Aegis when the first contact report came through from the long-range arrays. 30 years into my command, 16 of them spent as the station's senior flag officer, and I had run the Kovari scenario. Their specific scenario, their specific fleet silhouettes, their exact transmission protocols, 642 times in live exercises. I had stood in this same observation bay and watched the simulation play out on the same screens that were now showing me real ships. The screens did not know the difference. The power readings looked the same. The formation geometry looked the same. The slow bloom of 214 drive signatures emerging from a transit collapse looked the same as every time I had watched it in drill. But I knew the difference. Every officer on my deck knew the difference. You could hear it in the quality of the silence between their status reports, not the easy, professional silence of a crew running an exercise they know they will complete and go to mess afterward, but the compressed, weight-bearing silence of people who understand that the thing they have spent their careers preparing for has arrived, and that what they do in the next hours will matter in a way that drills do not. 214 contacts, said my sensor lead, Lieutenant Commander Orvath. He was young enough that his voice carried just a trace of something I recognized, not fear exactly, but the body's ancient insistence that this was significant. He had been born into the prepared world, same as most of my crew. He had grown up knowing the Kovari name, knowing their silhouette, knowing that one day they might come back. Knowing and feeling are not the same thing. Formation consistent with Kovari Conclave Fleet doctrine, third restitution pattern. They're painting us with their passive arrays but not transmitting yet. They're looking at their old approach charts, I said, trying to match what they see against what they expected. Their charts are 30,000 years out of date, Captain General. Yes, give them a moment. I looked through the observation deck at the Earth below. It was mid-morning over the North Atlantic, the cloud cover thin and broken, the coastlines crisp and visible from our altitude. Even from this height I could see the geometry of it, the Thornwall power spine along the eastern seaboard, the shimmer of the atmospheric processing grid above the equatorial band, the slow transit of the Meridian Fleet's third carrier group crossing the cloud layer below us like a procession of mountains learning to move. 7 warships in that group alone, each one between 2 and 4 kilometers in length, their drive signatures barely visible from our angle as they held to below-cloud discipline. And that was just what happened to be below our current orbital position. There were 42 such groups positioned across the globe, most of them well beneath the cloud ceiling, invisible to the approach vectors the Kovari would be using, because we had decided long ago that there was no reason to show everything at once. Patience. My predecessor's predecessor used to say that patience was not a virtue, it was a technology. The patient civilization invests in what isn't needed yet. The impatient one spends on what's needed now and arrives at the crisis empty-handed. Humanity had been patient for 30,000 years, and the bill was about to come due. I had reviewed the Kovari historical files again the night before, as I did each anniversary of the designation date, as the command tradition required. Not because I might have forgotten anything, the files were as familiar to me as my own service record, but because the review was itself part of the preparation. The act of returning to the source documents, of reading the original Kovari survey reports in their own language and their own notation, was a reminder of what the preparation was for and who it was against. The Kovari had not been careless. Their assessment of this system had been conducted by people who were professionally thorough in the ordinary scope of their work. The biological intervention had been sophisticated. The bombardment had been calculated. They had used every instrument available to them to verify that the dominant species of the third planet would not survive, and when those instruments had returned the readings they expected, they had filed the designation, departed the system, and moved on. They had been wrong. Their instruments had missed something. We had never determined exactly what, and the question belonged more to paleobiology than to defense planning. But the point was not that they had been wrong. The point was that they had not come back to check. The follow-up verification cycle called for by conclave protocol had never been conducted. The file had sat in an administrative queue, inactive, for 30,000 years, accruing bureaucratic dust while the species it described rebuilt from near nothing and spent 3 centuries of that time specifically reading the Kovari's own administrative records and learning what a follow-up verification visit would look like. We had not been angry, or rather, we had been in the early centuries. There were records of that, the political speeches, the council debates, the generations for whom the Kovari designation was a fresh wound rather than a healed scar. But anger is a poor fuel for 30,000 years of institutional preparation. What the preparation had run on was something quieter and more durable, the specific, non-negotiable conviction that a thing which had happened once would not happen again, not because the universe had been adjusted to prevent it, but because we would be ready. The transmission came 12 minutes after first contact, which told me their navigational confusion was real. At their approach speed, they should have opened a channel within 7 minutes under standard conclave doctrine. They had spent 5 extra minutes looking at their charts, and then at their sensors, and then at their charts again, trying to reconcile what their oldest records said this system should contain with what their instruments were actually telling them. The passive array data would be alarming to them. Not because it showed anything hostile. We had kept the batteries at station-keeping power and the intercept vessels in non-threatening orbits, but because of the sheer density of what was there. Installation after installation, power signature after power signature, the orbital shell of a planet that had been doing nothing but building, quietly and without any particular urgency, for 30 millennia. I imagine that sensor readout felt, to a Kovari tactical officer, the way a closed door feels when you push against it, and it does not move and you realize slowly that it was not a door you were pushing but a wall. The channel that opened was not a hailing frequency. It was a broadcast on the old conclave administrative band, the same band they had used 30,000 years ago when they had designated Earth as Extinction Zone 17 Provisional. The fact that they opened on that band, rather than a standard approach frequency, told me 2 things: that their command staff had been trained on historical records rather than contemporary intelligence, and that they expected no one to be listening on the other end. The broadcast was meant to be logged, not answered. A formality for a formality. The administrative machinery completing a cycle it had begun 300 centuries ago. The voice that came through was cold and formal in the way of old institutional power, the tone of an entity that has never considered it necessary to explain itself, because explanation implies the existence of a party whose understanding matters. This is Fleet Sovereign Adraz Keel of the Kovari Restitution Command, aboard the primary vessel Endless Claim. We are executing a formal administrative closure under the Conclave Extinction Zone Reclamation Protocol, Designation 17 Provisional, assigned to the third planet of this system under the authority of the Conclave Restitution Charter. All existing designations are hereby confirmed. Our presence is a legal administrative action. Any structure or installation in this system is subject to assessment and reclamation at the Conclave's discretion. He paused. I think he expected something, a burst of automated beacon, perhaps, or the crackle of an ancient distress signal, some artifact of the long-dead civilization his records told him had once been here. A confirmation that the extinction was complete and the zone was clear for closure. The kind of silence that answers a question by not being any kind of answer at all. What he got was me. "Fleet Sovereign Keel," I said. My voice was even. Orvath had the channel open on the command deck, but he had the good sense not to look at me. Every officer at every station was focused on their board, which was the correct posture, not performance of indifference, but genuine attention to the work that mattered. The work was not listening to me talk. The work was watching every sensor return on every Kovari vessel and being ready for whatever came next. This is Captain General Sira Voss, Commanding Officer of Thornwall Aegis Station, Earth Defense Command, Unified Planetary Authority. You are transmitting on an archived administrative band. I suggest you shift to the standard approach frequency for this system. I'll remain on both until you do. 11 seconds of silence. Transmission lag plus the time it takes a man to understand that the silence he expected has been replaced by something that should not be possible. Something that is talking back at him from a system his records say contains no one. Then identify your installation. I did. Thornwall Aegis Station. You're looking at it. It's the large structure in your sensor returns at bearing 470 by Mark 11 from your current position. If your instruments are calibrated for conclave standard resolution, you may have us registered as an anomaly rather than a structure because we exceed the upper end of the scale your systems were built to read. I'm told that's a common problem. Another pause, longer this time. Your records, I continued not harshly but with clarity, describe this system as Extinction Zone 17 provisional. I understand why. 30,000 years ago, the Kovari Conclave determined that the dominant species of this system had been rendered non-viable by a combination of orbital bombardment and biological intervention. The Conclave's assessment was filed, and the zone was designated for eventual administrative closure. I have read those records. They are very thorough as far as they go. You have read, he stopped himself. We have a very good archive. We've had 30,000 years to organize it. I let that sit for a moment. The assessment was incorrect. The species was not rendered non-viable. The species survived, rebuilt, and has spent the intervening period preparing, among other things, for the possibility that you might eventually come back to close the file. I want to be helpful to you, Fleet Sovereign, because your arrival on our approach vectors puts you in a position I'd prefer to resolve without further cost to either of us. May I show you what you're looking at? The silence this time was not the silence of a man who has no answer. It was the silence of a man who has too many and none of them are the right shape for what is happening to him. Transmit, he said finally. I nodded to Orvath, who had been holding the sensor package ready since the first contact report. We had not prepared it in the last 40 minutes. It had been prepared for 412 years, updated with every new installation, every new carrier group commissioning, every expansion of the Meridian Arsenal and the lunar garrison and the asteroid belt forward posts. The document was current as of last week's routine update cycle, which was the same week it was always current as of, because the update cycle had been running for 412 years without interruption. It went out on the broadband channel, not targeted at the flagship, but broadcast to every Kovari vessel in the formation. The full orbital shell, rendered in our notation and theirs, Thornwall's dimensions, the 42 carrier group signatures below the cloud ceiling, the Meridian Arsenal in the L2 point, which they probably hadn't found yet because it didn't emit anything a passive array could readily classify without knowing what to look for. The deep system installations, the lunar garrison, the asteroid belt forward posts, the long gun battery count without the specific targeting parameters, because I wanted them to know the number without knowing the specifics that would tell them how to defeat it. We sent it in Kovari notation because we had 30,000 years of Kovari administrative records and had decoded their measurement systems inside of 4 centuries. The translation project had been one of the early institutional priorities. If they ever came back, we wanted to be able to speak to them in their own units of measure. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things of that kind accumulate, and what they accumulate into is the ability to have a conversation rather than a standoff. "This is not possible," said a new voice on the channel, younger, tighter. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has just had the experience of watching a number appear on their display, and then checking the calibration 3 times because the number cannot be right. An aide or a tactical officer, someone who had been handed a sensor board and was watching the figures arrive, and could not make them fit into any framework that made sense. "It is somewhat unusual," I agreed, "but I assure you the readings are accurate. You're welcome to bring your arrays to full active mode and confirm. We'll hold our position." What followed was 17 minutes of what I can only describe as the sound of an institution processing information it was not built to process. There were transmissions within the Kovari formation. We picked them up easily on the passive arrays, their encryption standard being 30,000 years out of date, and the content of those transmissions was not tactical planning. It was argument. Fleet Sovereign Keel's command staff arguing with each other about what they were seeing, whether our figures were fabricated as some kind of bluff, what the operational doctrine said about a situation the operational doctrine had never anticipated. The Kovari conclave was old and it was powerful, in the way that old institutions are powerful, not because of what they can do, but because of the unquestioned weight of what they have always done. They had come to close an administrative file. The file, as far as their records were concerned, was 30,000 years old. The entry status was extinction complete/pending closure, and the physical survey team's job was to confirm the designation and log the formal closure, so the zone could be reassigned to whatever purpose the conclave currently needed a cleared planetary system for. Nobody in the Kovari Command School had ever run an exercise for what happened when the extinction didn't take. I used the 17 minutes to review my own board. Thornwall's long gun batteries were at station keeping power, not firing power, which is where I wanted them. The battery crews were at their stations, had been since the contact alert 40 minutes ago, but I had not ordered them to charge. A charged battery looks different on a sensor array than an uncharged one, and I wanted the Kovari to be making their decisions without the pressure of looking at 247 gun emplacements that were cycling up to release temperature. They could see the emplacements. The count was in the document I had sent them. Knowing they existed and watching them charge are different experiences, and I wanted the Kovari command staff's decision-making to happen in the former condition rather than the latter. I also reviewed the intercept vessel dispositions. The 42 carrier groups were below the cloud ceiling, exactly where they had been when the contact report came in. Some of my junior flag officers had recommended, in the weeks leading up to this date, we had tracked the Kovari formation from the deep system arrays for 11 days before contact, that we preposition elements of the fleet in a more visible posture. Show them the warships above the cloud ceiling, let the scale land immediately. I had overruled it. Showing everything at once is what you do when you want to intimidate. What I wanted was for the Kovari command staff to understand their situation at a pace that gave them time to reach their own conclusions, rather than being hit with the full picture and making a reactive decision under shock. They would need to make a choice, and I wanted the choice to be theirs, made calmly, with full information and adequate time to think. My executive officer, Commander Thaddeus Braille, came to stand beside me at the observation window. He was tall and quiet, 12 years younger than me, and he had the useful quality of saying things plainly without decoration. "Formation is holding at outer marker," he said. "No movement yet." They're talking. We're listening. I know, I watched the Earth below. A storm system was building over the North Pacific, the spiral beginning to organize itself against the pale blue of the ocean, the first organizing bands visible from altitude. Thaddeus, when this is over, I want the conclave's full record package archived in the main library under a new classification, not historical active diplomatic reference. He nodded, understanding what I meant without my needing to say it. Whatever happened today, the Kovari would go home carrying information. And the conclave, once it processed what its fleet was about to tell it, would not simply close the file and move on. There would be a long period of adjustment, of political recalibration, of whatever large and old institutions do when a foundational assumption turns out to have been wrong for 30 millennia. I preferred to be prepared for that conversation as well. The preparation for what happened after today had been running in parallel with the preparation for today itself, in the way that a thorough military planning staff always models the phase that follows the phase they are currently in. The channel opened again. Fleet Sovereign Keel this time, and his voice had changed. Not broken, the man was not without composure, but recalibrated. The institutional coldness was still there, but it was doing something different now. It was covering rather than projecting. The tone of a man who has been told something that requires him to revise a very large assumption, and is doing so in real time, without the luxury of doing it privately. Captain General Voss, the figures in your transmission, they represent active installations. Active and crude, yes. The figures for the Thornwall station represent this installation only. The carrier group figures in the orbital shell represent approximately 40% of Earth's in-atmosphere fleet assets. I did not include the deep system installations in that summary because I didn't want to make the document unwieldy, but I'm happy to provide a complete breakdown if it would help your planning. Your planning, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not anger, not exactly, but the affront of a man who has arrived to perform an administrative function and found himself being planned around rather than planning. A man accustomed to being the one who sets the terms of a situation, who has built a career on the institutional authority that allows him to walk into a zone and declare it closed, encountering for the first time the experience of being the less prepared party in the room. I mean no discourtesy, I said. I use the word accurately. You have arrived with 214 warships under the authority of an administrative designation that no longer reflects the status of this system. You have several options available to you. I'm trying to give you the information you need to choose well. You are advising me. I'm trying to help you, yes. Another silence, shorter this time. I had the sense of a man deciding whether to be offended or whether to be practical, and choosing correctly the latter. What are your options, Captain General, for us? I had thought about this for 30 years. My predecessors had thought about it for centuries before me. The Kovari scenario was not a fantasy. It was a planning document, updated on a 7-year cycle, reviewed by the full command staff, exercised twice a year in live drills. The question of what to say to a returning Kovari fleet when it arrived was one that Earth's defense planners had been working on for a very long time, because the question of how you speak to a power that tried to end you, how you balance the weight of what was done against the possibility of what comes next, is not a simple one, and it does not get simpler with time. It gets more complicated. In fact, 30,000 years of preparation means 30,000 years of memory. The people who built Thornwall did not build it out of abstract precaution. They built it because they remembered, in the specific and personal way that surviving civilizations remember, what it meant to be designated an extinction zone by someone who didn't bother to confirm the extinction was complete before filing the paperwork. The memory was not in the history books only. It was in the architecture. It was in the engineering specifications of the long gun batteries, which were built to the tolerances necessary to defeat Kovari hull plating as it existed 30,000 years ago, and then updated on a rolling basis, as the intelligence assessments gave us reason to adjust. It was in the approach protocols, which had been designed specifically around Kovari transit emergence patterns. It was in the alert systems, which had been calibrated to recognize the specific electromagnetic signature of a Kovari drive field since before this station was built. You could argue, and some historians had, that the entire outer orbital infrastructure of Earth was, in some deep sense, a monument to that specific day 30,000 years ago, when a Kovari fleet had determined that the third planet's dominant species was finished and had filed the paperwork confirming it. We had not forgotten. We had not been able to forget, because forgetting would have meant dismantling the apparatus of remembering, and no one in the long chain of human command had ever been willing to give that order. Some things you keep current not because you expect to use them, but because the act of keeping them current is itself a statement about what you are and what you hold in memory. I said, you can withdraw, full formation, all 214 vessels, back through your transit point and on to wherever the Restitution Fleet stages from. I'll give you a formal acknowledgement of your departure for your records, a document confirming that the Kovari Restitution Command presented at this system, observed conditions, and withdrew under their own authority. You can file that with the conclave as a preliminary survey report. It accurately describes what happened. It gives your institution time to process what you've learned today before any further decisions are made. And your second option: you can remain in your current position and we can continue this conversation at length. I have no objection to that. There are things about this system's history that you may find useful to understand, and I imagine there are questions your command staff would want answered before submitting any report to the conclave. I am willing to have that conversation. It may take time, and I want you to know I'm not in a hurry. He was quiet for a moment. I heard, just at the edge of the channel's audio, the soft chirp of a Kovari interface being adjusted, a sound I recognized from the reconstructed recordings in the archive, a specific frequency that the signals analysis team had identified in the early centuries of the records decoding project as corresponding to a tactical display query. And if I were to advance? I had expected the question. I had run it in exercises many times. I had a prepared answer, and I gave it simply, without theater, without raising my voice or adding any particular weight to the words beyond what the words themselves carried. If you advance, I'll ask you to reconsider. If you continue to advance, I'll ask you again. If you fire on this station or on any Earth installation, I will respond with proportionate and overwhelming force. I have the authority to make that decision without referring to any higher command, and I have the means to execute it. I would prefer not to. The cost would be real on both sides, and the outcome would not be in question. But it would be a cost, and I don't think a cost serves anyone here today. The word proportionate is doing a great deal of work in a sentence like that, and I knew it. I said it knowing that the Kovari tactical staff was, even then, running the mathematics of what proportionate meant when applied to what Thornwall could bring to bear. The battery count, the firing arc coverage, the known characteristics of the carrier groups below the cloud ceiling, the unknowns of the deep system installations I had not quantified in the transmitted document. The mathematics would not come out in the Kovari fleet's favor. I did not need to say that. The sensor data elaborated quite clearly. The word proportionate, in that context, carried the weight of everything behind it without my having to describe it. "You have been waiting for us," said Fleet Sovereign Keel. "Yes, since before this station was built. Since before most of the installations in this system were built. The preparation began very shortly after your fleet left. It has been ongoing. Thornwall itself is 412 years old. It was the third major orbital platform installed in Earth's defense network, and it is not the largest. The silence that came back lasted long enough that I began to count it. 14 seconds. 15. I did not fill it. I had learned over 30 years of command that silence offered to a counterpart who is thinking is a gift, and that the impulse to fill silence is almost always the impulse of the person who is less certain of their position, not the one who is more certain. "You built all of this for us," he said. "We built all of this in response to what was done to us, yes." The Kovari designation was the event that organized the preparation. Other civilizations have since made themselves known in the intervening years, and the infrastructure serves general purposes as well. But the specific defensive architecture you're looking at, the approach protocols, the battery targeting algorithms, the intercept fleet doctrines, those were written specifically for your fleet profiles and your tactical doctrine, updated each time we got new intelligence that warranted an update. You had intelligence on us. We've been collecting it for about 25,000 years. Your traders occasionally come through the outer systems. Your diplomatic vessels have been observed at several adjacent civilizations' territories. We've been thorough. I paused. We are, as a civilization, very thorough. I watched the formation on the sensors. The Kovari fleet was a serious force by any standard, 214 warships, the heavy classes in the rear, the lighter intercept vessels spread across the leading edge. They had come prepared for a clearance operation, which in Kovari doctrine meant they had come prepared for the possibility of defensive structures and automated systems, perhaps a settled population on a frontier world that needed to be moved. They had not come prepared for this. Nobody comes prepared for being outmatched by something they designated a ruin 30,000 years ago. There are moments in command that feel like the point of a long arc, not the apex exactly, because the arc doesn't end here, but the point at which the trajectory becomes visible. The point from which you can see both ends of the thing you are part of. The beginning, 30,000 years behind you, when a people near extinction decided that this would not happen to them again. And the continuation, stretching forward into whatever this day opened, which would not be simple or resolved but would be different from what it had been before. I had spent my career as part of a chain of people whose job was to be ready for this day, and the chain went back so far that the first links in it were myths by now, the founding generation of the long preparation, the people who had looked at the sky after the Kovari left and decided, in some fundamental and unshakable way, that this would never happen to them again. Not to them, and not to whoever came after them, and not to whoever came after that. The decision had been made so long ago that it had become a feature of the civilization, not a policy that could be voted on or revised, but a structural fact, like gravity, like the distance between stars. Orvath cleared his throat, quietly, in the way of someone who has noticed something that the person in command needs to know. "Movement," he said. I looked at the board. The Kovari formation was not advancing. 3 vessels in the middle left quadrant of the formation had shifted out of position, a lateral movement, slow, the kind that can be adjustment or can be preparation for a firing solution depending on what follows it. My battery commanders would be watching it. I watched it too. The movement had not been part of any of the scenarios I had exercised this quarter, which was how I knew it was not Fleet Sovereign Keel's command. A fleet commander who is engaged in a diplomatic channel does not order a formation shift in his middle section without telling the person on the other end. A movement like that without announcement is either an accident or an independent action. "Designate them," I said. Designated. They are the cruiser-class vessels Reclamation's Hand, Keel's Warrant, and the Conclave's Passage. Third Restitution Doctrine puts those 3 in the fire support role for a contested zone clearance operation. So someone in the Kovari fleet had decided that the diplomatic exchange was either a stall or an irrelevance, and had begun moving to a firing position without the Fleet Sovereign's authorization. I understood that logic, not approved of it, but understood it. In a command structure built on institutional certainty, the experience of finding that certainty misplaced can generate a reactive impulse in officers who have no other framework for the situation. The framework they had was clearance doctrine. They were reaching for the only tool they had been given for a zone that was supposed to be empty. I opened the channel. Fleet Sovereign Keel. I'm observing a formation adjustment in your middle section. 3 cruiser-class vessels moving to what appears to be a fire support alignment. I want to be transparent with you. My battery commanders have noticed it as well, and they have standing orders regarding preparatory fire postures. I am not escalating yet. I'm asking you to bring those vessels back into their position in the formation. Keel's response was not immediate, which confirmed the read. He was dealing with a flag officer who had taken a position independent of the Fleet Sovereign's command. That was a command problem of a kind I recognized from my own early career. The officer who believes that action is preferable to the perceived uncertainty of a superior's restraint, who interprets patience as indecision and moves to fill what they read as a vacuum. I am addressing an internal matter, he said, and his voice was clipped in the way of a commanding officer who has just received information he did not ask for and is reacting to it while trying to maintain the appearance of being in control of his situation. Hold your position. I'm holding, I said. Take whatever time you need. What came next happened over 40 seconds, which is a long time in the arithmetic of weapons systems, and a very short time in the context of a command dispute. I could hear it on the intercept channel without translation, the tone of an order being given, the response that was not quite compliance, the repetition of the order with something added to its register that changed its nature from a request to a statement of authority that would not be refused. A fleet sovereign asserting, across whatever communication was happening inside that formation, that he was still the fleet sovereign and that the situation was his to manage. The 3 cruisers moved back into formation. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me, said Keel. His voice had something in it now that had not been there at the start of the conversation. Not anger, not shame exactly, but the weight of a man who is beginning to understand the full scope of his situation and finding the understanding uncomfortable in a way that is not easily discharged. He had come to administer a formality. He had found himself negotiating. He had nearly watched an officer under his command open fire on an installation he had no standing to fire on. The formality was not going to happen, and whatever report he filed with the conclave was not going to be the report anyone in that institution had been expecting. The vessels have returned to formation. I see that, I appreciate it. You said we could withdraw. I did. And the document you mentioned. The acknowledgement. I'll have it prepared. It will say, in plain language, that the Kovari Restitution Fleet, 214 vessels under the command of Fleet Sovereign Adraz Keel, arrived at this system on this date, that the system was found to be under the active sovereignty of the Unified Planetary Authority of Earth, that the Restitution Fleet observed conditions and withdrew under their own authority, and that the administrative designation of Extinction Zone 17 Provisional is no longer accurate and should be formally updated in the conclave's records. I'll sign it and transmit it to you before you leave. A long pause. You have a prepared template for this document. We do. How long have you had a prepared template for this document? About 3,000 years. We've revised it several times as our diplomatic conventions evolved. The current version is 119 years old. The sound that came back across the channel was not quite a response. It was the beginning of several responses, each reconsidered before it reached his mouth, the sound of a man working through something in real time that he had not been given the language for. Finally, how many of your people know about this? The waiting. All of them, I said. It is not a secret. It is part of our history and our institutional memory. Children learn about the Kovari designation as part of the standard historical curriculum. It is why this station exists. It is why most of what you can see on the sensor array exists. We have not hidden it. There is nothing to hide. It is simply what we are and what we chose to become after your fleet left. You built all of this. We built all of this, yes. Over 30,000 years. Not all of it in response to you specifically. A civilization that has been building infrastructure for 30 millennia builds a great deal for many reasons. But the specific defensive architecture you're looking at was designed with a specific scenario in mind. Your scenario. Your fleet profiles, your approach patterns, your tactical doctrine. We kept the records, and we updated the preparations to match. He said nothing for a moment. I had the sense, and I have been around command staff long enough to read tone across significant communications barriers and through the flattening effect of translation software, that Adraz Keel was not a small man in the moral sense. He was an official of a large and powerful institution, and the institution had done something 30,000 years ago that the institution had never revisited, because the institution had filed the result and moved on. He had inherited the file. He had come to close it. He had found it was not closed, and he was now, in real time, coming to terms with the scale of what that meant, not just for his mission, but for his understanding of what the Kovari Conclave was, and what it had done, and what the other files in the archive might look like if someone ever went back to check them. That was not my problem to solve today. It was a problem that would belong to an institution and a civilization far from here, in whatever reckoning they chose to undertake or not undertake. My problem was simpler and more immediate: to end this day without more deaths than had already occurred, and to send the Kovari home with enough clarity to prevent another fleet from making the same trip. "I'll take your withdrawal offer," said Keel. "I want the document transmitted before we move." "Understood. Give me 20 minutes. I turned from the channel, not closing it, leaving it open so he could hear the activity on the command deck, the ordinary professional sound of a station doing its work. Orvath was already pulling the template. Braille was at the communications board. My legal officer, Warrant Captain Demies, had appeared from wherever she had been monitoring the exchange. She had a talent for materializing at the exact moment she was needed, and she had served in the legal division for 8 years without ever giving me reason to wish she hadn't, and was reviewing the document parameters with the economy of someone who had also spent a long time thinking about this day and knew exactly what it required. I was partway across the deck when the shot came. It was not from the 3 cruisers. It was from the far edge of the formation, a light escort-class vessel, designation unknown in our records, positioned at the outer extent of the Kovari left flank. A single directed energy discharge, medium yield, aimed not at Thornwall but at the orbital relay station we maintained at the L1 approach corridor. A small installation, 12 crew. The relay station served as a communications amplifier for the outer system monitoring network, and its loss would degrade our early warning range by about 6%, which suggested the firing crew had some intelligence about our infrastructure beyond what a passive array survey could produce. That mattered, and I noted it. What mattered more immediately was that 12 people who had been alive 3 seconds ago were not. It took 4.2 seconds from the discharge detection to the battery return fire. That was not a reaction time I had set. It was the reaction time the targeting system had been built to, worked out by engineers 412 years ago who had decided that a 4.2-second response to a weapon's discharge against any Earth installation was the correct balance between preventing further damage and not firing so fast that there was no possibility of a misclassification check. The battery crew had not needed me to give an order, because the standing rules of engagement were clear and had been clear for 412 years, and the battery crew had trained to those rules of engagement for the entirety of their careers, and their training had told them what to do, and they did it. The escort-class ship ceased to exist at the 4.2-second mark. I was at the communications board by then, and I opened the channel to Keel. "Fleet Sovereign," My voice was level. I needed it to be level, not because I did not feel anything, but because the channel was not the place for what I felt, and because the conversation we were about to have required the same precision and steadiness as every other part of this day. One of your vessels fired on an Earth installation. The relay station at L1 is destroyed. 12 of my crew are dead. I have responded with a battery salvo at the firing vessel in accordance with our standing rules of engagement. The firing vessel is gone. I'm not escalating further at this time. If any additional vessel in your formation fires on any Earth installation or on the station, I will respond in kind, and I will not stop until I am satisfied that the threat is resolved. Do you understand me? I understand you. His voice was different now. Not shattered, the man still had composure, but something had changed in it, something adjacent to the distance he had maintained throughout the conversation. The vessel acted without my authority. I know, I heard the command channel. I let that sit for a moment, not cruelly. Just clearly. My offer stands. The document will be transmitted in 17 minutes. When you receive it, you may withdraw. The crew of that vessel. They are gone, Fleet Sovereign, as are 12 of mine. The arithmetic is not going to improve by discussing it, and I would rather get you home with the rest of your people intact. The document will be ready in 17 minutes. He closed the channel. I stood at the communications board and looked at the orbital relay station on the sensor display, or rather at the absence where it had been, the gap in the installation map that had not been there 4 minutes ago. 12 names I was going to have to learn by the end of the day, because a commanding officer knows the names of the people who die on their watch, and they carry those names in a way that is different from the way a history carries them. The history is a record. The commanding officer is a memory. I was going to be a memory for 12 people I had not known this morning, people who had come to their station this morning to do the work that made the system function, and who had not come home. This is the cost of the long preparation. It is not paid once. It is not paid only by the generation that begins the work. It is paid every time by whoever is standing at the station when the bill comes due. The preparation had been built on the premise that the bill was worth paying, and I believed that, and I believed it without qualification. But belief without qualification does not make the payment anything other than what it is. Braille was beside me. He did not say anything immediately, which was the right choice. "Relay station watch crew," I said. "Get me the names before the document goes out." "Already pulling them," he said. "And the firing vessel, do we have a designation?" "We're cross-referencing the formation records now. It's not in our database. We have the 3 main cruiser classes and the heavy assets, but the escort configuration on the left flank was newer than our most recent intelligence update. We're calling it Formation Outlier 7 for tracking purposes. Note in the after-action that it fired without apparent fleet command authorization. Kiel's command intercepts support that reading. It matters for what comes after this, for the diplomatic record, and for the conclave's internal accounting of what happened here." Noted. The document went out at the 18-minute mark, 1 minute late, because the 12 names came through at the 16-minute mark, and I had added a line. Not a long line. A specific one. A notation that the Kovari Formation Escort designated Formation Outlier 7 had discharged its weapons against the Earth relay station at L1 without apparent authorization from the Fleet Command, that the relay station crew of 12 had been killed as a result, and that the Thornwall Aegis station had responded under standing rules of engagement. It was not an accusation, and it was not a demand. It was a fact recorded in a formal document that the Kovari Conclave would be reading for a long time, and I wanted the fact to be in the document. An institution that knew what it had done in the past and what one of its vessels had done today. That institution was slightly more likely to weigh the next decision carefully. Kiel acknowledged receipt of the document, without further communication on the main channel. The withdrawal began 17 minutes after that. 213 warships in a slow formation turn, the heavy classes leading back toward their transit corridor, the lighter intercept vessels folding in behind them, the whole structure of the Restitution Fleet becoming something that was leaving rather than something that was arriving. I watched it from the observation deck. My crew watched it from their stations, and the silence on the deck had changed quality again. Not the compressed, weight-bearing silence of people waiting for something to happen, but the quieter silence of people who have been part of something significant and are still feeling the shape of it. Before the last Kovari vessel reached the transit corridor, Keel opened the channel one final time. Captain General Voss. Fleet Sovereign. The document says your installation is 412 years old. Correct. And the preparations began before that. Significantly before. The first formal defense planning for a Kovari return scenario was initiated approximately 600 years after your fleet's departure from this system. The work has been continuous since then. A long silence. I did not fill it. We were certain the zone was clear, he said. The cold institutional register was gone now. What was left was something that did not have a Kovari word in my vocabulary, but that I recognized as honest. The assessment was thorough. The biological agent was designed for complete effect. We verified the initial results. I know what it was, I said. We recovered the records, the complete records, the survey data, the intervention specifications, the verification protocols. They are in our archive. It should have been complete. It wasn't. I don't know whether that was an error in the application or an error in the assessment model, and I want to be honest with you that after 30,000 years, we don't have a definitive scientific answer to that question. What I can tell you is that some of us survived. Not many, but enough, and we remembered. We did not check, he said. It was not quite an apology. It was something more uncomfortable than an apology and more honest than one, the acknowledgement, said aloud to the person who had the standing to hear it, that the thing had been done, and that the verification had not followed, and that the two failures together had a consequence that was now standing in front of him on a communications channel. We filed the designation and did not return to verify. That is in the protocol. The follow-up survey was scheduled and then deprioritized. I reviewed the administrative record before this mission and found the notation. Priority shift, resource reallocation, the zone reclassified as low priority pending closure. Standard procedure for a zone with confirmed results. Yes, I said. I will say that to the conclave. I hope you do. Another silence. The other zones, he said. There was something measured in how he said it, carefully, the way you say a thing that you have been turning over in your mind for a while and have decided to say anyway, knowing it will change something. In the archive, the Restitution Command has 47 active extinction zone designations across the Conclave's territorial survey, 47 files that have never had a formal follow-up conducted. I had known this. It was in the records we had decoded. Yes, I said. I think we should look at the other files. Fleet Sovereign Keel, I said, and I let my voice carry something that was not quite warmth but was not indifference either. The tone of a person who has spent 30 years thinking about a day like this and has decided in advance how she wants it to end, not with triumph and not with judgment but with something that has the possibility of being used. That would be a very good idea. He closed the channel. The last Kovari vessel crossed the transit threshold and was gone. I stood at the observation window for a long time after. The storm system over the North Pacific had organized itself further. The spiral was tighter now, the cloud bands drawn in toward the center with the purposeful geometry of a large system that has found its structure. Below me, the carrier groups were standing down from intercept alert, their signatures relaxing from the bright, hard edge of combat readiness back to the steady, low hum of ships that are on station and not at war. The Meridian Fleet's third carrier group was visible again below the cloud ceiling, 7 mountains moving in a slow line across the top of the world, and for a moment I let myself see them the way someone else might see them. Someone who hadn't grown up surrounded by them, hadn't spent a career aboard and beside them. What they would have looked like to the Kovari tactical staff, to Fleet Sovereign Keel, looking down from his approach vector at what the sensor array was telling him this system had become. The scale of it. The specific scale of a civilization that had decided, 30,000 years ago, that it would never be caught helpless again, and had meant it with every budget allocation and every training cycle and every generation of engineers who spent their careers building something whose purpose they might never see tested. We had not known when they were coming. We had not known if they were coming. We had spent 30,000 years preparing for a day that might never have arrived, and a great many people across that span of time had died of other causes, had lived their full lives, had built careers and families and legacies without ever seeing the thing they were preparing for. The preparation had outlasted all of them. It had outlasted their children and their children's children and their children's children's children, generation after generation. The institutional memory kept current, and the plans kept updated, and the exercises run twice a year, because that is what it means to truly decide that something will not happen to you again. It is not a decision you make once. It is a decision you make every day, in every budget allocation and every training cycle, and every late night in a planning room going over sensor specifications that might never be relevant. You make it so many times that it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like breathing, like the thing you simply are. Braille brought me the 12 names, written on paper the way I had asked. I read them twice. 12 people who had been at their station at the L1 corridor relay this morning, doing the ordinary work of the ordinary infrastructure that made everything else possible, who had not known that today was the day the Kovari came back, and who were now in the record of this day in a way they had not expected to be. I folded the paper and put it in my breast pocket, an old habit, physical paper in a physical hand, something I had learned from my commanding officer who had learned it from hers, and I kept it there, where I would feel it against my chest for the rest of the day, until I sat down tonight and wrote the after-action report in full and said each name aloud while I wrote it. Orvath at his station said quietly, "Ma'am, the formation is fully clear of the transit threshold. All contacts are gone from the board." "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander." He hesitated, the way young officers hesitate when they want to ask something and are not sure if the moment is right. I had learned to wait that hesitation out. "What do we log it as?" he said. I thought about that for a moment. There would be a formal designation. There always was, the date code, the contact classification, the resolution code, the bureaucratic notation for what had happened. I would write it correctly and completely, because a commanding officer writes the notation correctly and completely regardless of what she feels about the day. Log it as Kovari Restitution Fleet contact, resolved, no further action required at this time, I said. Note that fleet withdrawal was conducted under Fleet Sovereign's authority following diplomatic exchange. The L1 incident and casualties will follow in the formal after-action, filed tonight. Understood. I looked out through the observation window at the Earth below, at the storm still building over the Pacific, at the carrier groups moving below the cloud ceiling, at the long gun batteries cycling back down to station-keeping power. The quiet, purposeful sound of systems returning to standby, available, patient, ready. They would be ready again tomorrow. That was the thing about the long preparation. It did not end today. Today was a point in it, an important point, but the preparation was not a plan with a conclusion. It was a condition, a permanent feature of what we were and what we had decided to remain. There would be other contingencies, other files in other archives, Other days when the thing you had been getting ready for arrived and required you to be what you had spent your whole career becoming. The 12 names in my pocket, the 46 remaining Kovari Extinction Zone files, the conversation Keel would have with the conclave, the conversation that would follow in whatever form it took, across whatever span of years it required. The preparation had not ended. It had only changed what it was preparing for. That was how it always worked. We remembered, and the memory told us what to build next. We had always been very good at remembering.